They say, if someone wants you in their life, they'll make space for you. But what if the truth is quieter than that? What if some people don't make space? Not because they don't care, but because something inside them quietly closes the door before anyone can walk in. There are people who long for connection, yet somehow relationships never stay. Not because others always leave, but because something unseen keeps pushing them away. It doesn't look like rejection. It doesn't sound like distance. Sometimes it feels like independence or strength or simply needing space. But beneath that surface, there is often a silent pattern, a quiet reflex, a learned way of protecting something fragile. Why do some people withdraw when things begin to feel real? Why does closeness sometimes feel heavier than loneliness? This is not about blame. It's about understanding the truth behind a behavior many don't even realize they carry. Let's begin. There is a kind of distance that doesn't look like distance at all. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't slam doors or end conversations abruptly. Instead, it lingers quietly between words, in delayed replies, in conversations that never go too deep, in the subtle shift when something begins to feel too real. From the outside, it can look like calmness, like self-control, like someone who simply values their space. But underneath, something else is happening. There are moments when connection begins to open, when someone listens a little longer, asks a more personal question, or steps just slightly closer. And that's when it appears. Not loudly, but instinctively. A pause, a withdrawal, a change in tone. Why does closeness sometimes feel like pressure instead of comfort? For some, emotional distance is not a choice. It is a reflex, a quiet habit formed so early, it no longer feels like something separate from who they are. They may enjoy being around people, but only up to a point. They may care deeply, but struggle to show it when it matters most. They may even want to stay, and still feel the urge to step back. It's not always fear in the obvious sense. Sometimes it feels like irritation, like boredom, like a sudden need to be alone. But these feelings are often just the surface. Because when connection begins to ask for presence, for openness, for something real, something inside gently pulls away, not to hurt, not to reject, but to protect something that has learned quietly and over time that distance feels safer than being fully seen. No one learns to push people away overnight. It begins in moments that seem small at the time, but leave quiet imprints that last far longer than they should. Sometimes it starts in environments where love was present, but not always consistent, where warmth existed, but unpredictably, where care was given, but not always felt, where being seen depended on timing, mood, or circumstance. A child in that space doesn't analyze what's happening. They don't label it as emotional inconsistency or unmet needs. They simply adapt. They learn to read the room before expressing themselves. They learn to hold things in when it feels safer than reaching out. They learn that closeness can shift without warning. And slowly something begins to form. Not a decision, but a pattern. Stay close, but not too close. Feel, but don't depend. Care, but stay prepared to pull away. Because when connection feels uncertain, the safest place becomes somewhere in between, not fully open, but not completely closed. Over time, these patterns become quiet instincts. They follow into adulthood not as memories, but as reactions. You may not remember the exact moment you felt overlooked, or the time you reached out and didn't receive what you needed, but the body remembers the feeling of it. The slight tension when things get too close, the hesitation before being fully honest, the urge to retreat when something starts to matter. And so, even when connection later appears in a healthier form, even when someone shows consistency, patience, and care, something inside remains cautious. Not because the present is unsafe, but because the past taught you that safety can change without warning. So distance becomes a quiet form of control, a way to stay one step ahead of disappointment, a way to never fully depend on something that could disappear. Not because you don't want connection, but because, somewhere deep down, you learned that needing it too much once came at a cost. The mind is often misunderstood as something that seeks happiness. But at its core, it is built for survival. And survival does not ask, what feels good? It asks, what feels familiar and what feels risky? So when closeness begins to form, when someone starts to matter in a deeper way, the brain doesn't simply experience it as connection. It scans it, quietly, instantly, beneath awareness. It notices subtle cues, a change in tone, a moment of silence, the way someone looks a little too closely. And then it does something even more subtle. It compares those sensations to emotional memories stored long ago, not as clear images, not as specific events, but as feelings. The feeling of being let down, the feeling of not being fully understood, the feeling of giving more than was received. And when something in the present begins to resemble those feelings, even faintly, the brain reacts, not with panic, but with distance, a quiet emotional shift, a sudden loss of intensity, an unexplained urge to step back. Why does interest sometimes fade the moment it becomes real? Because the brain is not measuring the present objectively. It is filtering it through the past. And in that filter, closeness can feel unpredictable. And unpredictability to a protective system often feels like danger. So it intervenes. It softens emotional intensity before it deepens too far. It creates thoughts that justify distance. This isn't right. Something feels off. Maybe this isn't what I want. These thoughts feel logical, even certain, but often they arrive not from clarity, but from protection. Because to fully experience closeness would require stepping into something uncertain. And the brain, shaped by past instability, would rather retreat early than risk being overwhelmed later. So distance becomes automatic, not as a conscious decision, but as a silent promise the mind once made. If something feels too important, step back before it has the chance to hurt you. There is a quiet tension that lives beneath the surface of this pattern. It is not always visible to others, but internally, it can feel constant. A pull toward connection, and a simultaneous urge to escape it. First, everything feels natural. There is curiosity, interest, a sense of ease in being understood, even in small ways. Moments of laughter feel genuine. Conversations flow. There is a subtle comfort in not feeling alone. And then, something begins to change. Not all at once. Not dramatically, but enough to be felt. Closeness starts to carry weight. Expectations begin to feel implied, even if unspoken. The presence of another person begins to feel demanding. Why does something that once felt safe begin to feel overwhelming? Because intimacy is not just about being close to someone. It is about being visible, to be known, not just in strengths, but in uncertainties, contradictions, and unspoken fears. And for someone who has learned to protect those parts, that level of visibility can feel like standing without protection. So the mind responds, creates space, not always through obvious withdrawal, but through subtle shifts, a slower reply, a quieter tone, a feeling of needing distance without fully understanding why. And yet, the connection itself still matters. There is still care, still interest, still a part that wants to stay. This is where the conflict deepens, because leaving doesn't feel right, but staying doesn't feel easy. So the pattern continues, moving closer, then pulling away, opening up, then closing again, like standing at the edge of a shoreline, drawn to the calmness of the water, but unsure of how far it might pull you in. And in that uncertainty, distance begins to feel like control, a way to stay connected without ever feeling fully exposed. These patterns rarely announce themselves in obvious ways. They don't say, "I am pushing you away." Instead, they appear in small, ordinary moments, the kind that are easy to overlook. It can happen right after a meaningful conversation, when something real is shared, something honest, something unguarded. For a brief moment, there is closeness, a sense of being seen, and then distance. The energy shifts, replies become shorter, the warmth cools just slightly. Why does vulnerability sometimes lead to withdrawal instead of deeper connection? Or it shows up in the way conflict is handled. Not through anger, but through absence. Avoiding the conversation, changing the subject, letting silence do the work of creating space. Because staying present in discomfort can feel heavier than leaving it unresolved. Sometimes it looks like losing interest. Everything feels engaging at first. The curiosity, the attention, the emotional pull. But as soon as consistency begins to form, as soon as the connection asks for something steady, something fades. Not always the feeling, but the ability to stay with it. And then there are the quiet justifications. Maybe this isn't right. Maybe something is missing. Maybe I just need space. These thoughts feel true in the moment, clear, rational, but often they arrive at the exact point where closeness begins to deepen, as if something inside is gently redirecting the path away from intimacy, back toward familiarity. Because distance, even when it feels lonely, is still easier to control than the unknown depth of connection. There comes a moment, subtle, almost easy to miss, when something begins to feel familiar in an unfamiliar way. Not in others, but in yourself. Pattern starts to emerge. The same distance, appearing in different faces. The same ending repeating in different stories. The same feeling of almost close, almost understood, almost staying. And slowly a question forms. Why does this keep happening? At first, the answers may point outward. The timing wasn't right. The connection wasn't strong enough. The other person didn't understand. And sometimes, those things are true. But then, there are the quieter observations. The moments where you pulled back. Not because something was wrong, but because something felt too right. The times you needed space, not from the person, but from the feeling itself. And in that recognition, something shifts. Not into blame, not into regret, but into awareness. Because seeing a pattern is different from being trapped in it. It creates a small distance, not from others, but from the automatic reactions that once felt unavoidable. You begin to notice the pause before withdrawing, the thought before the excuse, the feeling before the distance. And in that space, something new quietly appears. Choice, not a loud, decisive change, but a soft awareness that what once felt like instinct may actually be something learned, something shaped, something that can be understood rather than obeyed. And that realization, however quiet, is often where everything begins to change. Walls are not built in a single moment. They are formed slowly, layer by layer, through experiences that asked for openness and returned something uncertain in its place. So it makes sense that they do not disappear all at once. Because these walls were never meant to isolate. They were meant to protect, to keep something tender from being overwhelmed, to create distance where closeness once felt unsafe. But over time, what protects can also confine. What creates safety can also limit connection. And somewhere in that awareness, a quiet shift begins. Not a sudden openness, not a complete surrender to vulnerability, but something softer, a willingness to stay a moment longer, to not immediately retreat when something feels real, to sit with the discomfort without needing to escape it. What happens when distance is no longer the only option? It doesn't mean fear disappears. It doesn't mean closeness suddenly feels easy, but it creates space for a different experience to exist alongside the old one. A moment where connection doesn't lead to loss. A conversation that doesn't turn into withdrawal. A presence that doesn't feel overwhelming. And slowly, almost quietly, the mind begins to learn something new, that not every closeness carries the same outcome, that not every vulnerability leads to the same pain. The walls don't need to be torn down. Sometimes, they just need to soften, to become less rigid, less automatic, so that connection is no longer something to escape, but something that can be approached gently, at a pace that feels safe enough to stay. Distance is often misunderstood. It is seen as indifference, as disinterest, as a quiet form of rejection. But sometimes, distance is not the absence of feeling. It is the presence of something unspoken, because not all silence is empty. Some of it is filled with thoughts that were never expressed, feelings that were never fully understood, fears that never found the right words. What if distance is not pushing people away, but protecting something that doesn't yet know how to stay? There are people who care deeply, who feel more than they show, who carry connections long after they've stepped back from them. But when closeness begins to ask for consistency, for openness, for a kind of presence that feels unfamiliar, distance becomes the language they know best. Not because they don't want to be close, but because they don't yet know how to remain there without losing themselves. So they step back, not always consciously, not always intentionally, and from the outside it looks like absence. But on the inside, it can feel like standing at a threshold, wanting to move forward, yet held back by something invisible. Distance, in this way, becomes a message, not of rejection, but of uncertainty, not of lack, but of something still learning how to exist in connection. And perhaps, when seen this way, it becomes softer, less about what is missing, and more about what has not yet found its way to the surface. If parts of this reflection felt familiar, if something quiet inside you was touched, then maybe this was never just about pushing people away. Maybe it was about trying to protect something that once felt too exposed, too uncertain, too easily affected by what it could not control. And that doesn't make you distant. It makes you human. There are patterns that form in silence, and for a long time they can feel like who you are. But they are not the whole story. They are simply chapters that have not yet been fully understood. And understanding, even in small moments, has a way of creating space where there was once only reaction. You are not alone in this experience, even if it has often felt that way. If you'd like to stay connected to reflections like this, quiet explorations of the human mind and the hidden corners of the heart, this space will always be here for you. And if you feel comfortable, you can share your thoughts below. Not because you have to, but because sometimes your words might help someone else feel a little less alone. Take care of yourself.